guys don't need this, you're advanced, so we can move on, right? Okay, so these are the lobes. Let's take a look at a diagram and just go over the lobes real quick. And you can see here in the superior view, this would be anterior here. So this is frontal, parietal, occipital. And notice there is a a sulcus here that is labeled as the central sulcus. I do want you to know this sulcus. Let's take a look though at a lateral view. And again, this is the longitudinal fissure, right? Going right down the center, longitudinal fissure. Okay, so here we have a lateral view of the cerebrum. It is like this, except they have this all color-coded for some stuff that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so basically like this. Okay, notice again, in this diagram, they're not showing you the brain stem or the cerebellum, so we're just focusing on the cerebrum. Okay, so I would like you to know this sulcus, okay, the central sulcus right here. The central sulcus actually separates the frontal and the parietal lobes, okay? It's the boundary between the frontal and the parietal lobes. Notice there is another sulcus here, okay, that is called the parieto-occipital. This name is very convenient because it tells you exactly what it separates, the parietal and occipital lobes, okay? So I would like you to know that one. And then this is the last one I would like you to know right here. This is the one we mentioned before. This is coming around the temporal lobe, so it kind of goes like this, but they're pulling the temporal lobe back, okay? So that one is called the lateral sulcus, okay? Lateral sulcus, labeled for you here, okay?
Is that also the insula? Is that also the insula?
So we'll talk about the insula in just a second. Yeah, so the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, right? Temporal lobe is here. Okay, so again, notice that when we pull the temporal lobe back and you look inside that central sulcus, you can see another area of the brain that's kind of tucked away inside there. So if you're just looking at a lateral view like this, you're not going to see it. You actually have to look inside the sulcus. And there's an area here that is called the insula, okay? That is considered to be a fifth lobe of the brain. So it is right here. Notice you can see it looks like it has its own cortex, and you can see the gyri in there, okay? That is the insula. You can also see that if you were to make a frontal or say a transverse cut, you could see that inside that lateral sulcus. So I will point that out on other diagrams. Okay, so now notice that you see how the brain is all color-coded here. What they are showing you, these different areas that are shown in different colors, these are called the functional areas of the cerebrum, okay? And we're gonna talk about those next. This is just a little introduction, kind of little overview of each of the lobes. You don't really have to worry about all this. It's just FYI. Okay, again, just a little bit of an overview of each lobe, but I would like to talk about the functional areas. Okay, now notice that these are the functional areas of the cortex. Do you guys remember the cortex? It's the outer few millimeters of the cerebrum. We had looked at that before in the frontal cut. Let me show you that again. You guys remember? It looks like this, right? This is the cortex, and this is supposed to be 6 layers of neuron cell bodies. It is where anything that's happening on a conscious level is happening somewhere in the cortex. So as you can imagine, this is really complex, and it's highly, excuse me, highly organized, so that there's different areas that control different types of functions, okay? So I'm sure we, of course, do not understand everything about the cortex yet. It's always being researched, but we know what a lot of these parts of the cortex do. So a lot of them are mapped out for you here, and I would like you to know them. So you'll see on in your study guide, there's a list of these functional areas. I will have you guys identify them on the model, okay? Dun, 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 dun. I will be very clear exactly, as to exactly what I want you to identify. I'll point right to it, but you have to know these, okay? So let's run through these really quick. Okay, so first of all, again, we said this is the central sulcus. And I'm just gonna kind of outline that for you. And so notice there's a gyrus just anterior to it. The location of this gyrus, because it's just in front of the central sulcus, this is called the precentral gyrus. But this name just tells you location. The functional area that's located there is the primary motor area, okay? So this is what's called the primary motor area. So obviously, it's gonna have something to do with motor function. The frontal lobe in general is an area that does a lot of things, but one of the things that happens here is control of skeletal muscle, right? Skeletal muscle, okay? So primary motor area. So this area is going to be important for sending action potentials that are going to go out to our skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscle meaning voluntary movement, right? These neurons have their cell bodies here. The axons travel down through the spinal cord and synapse in the spinal cord on neurons that go to our muscles. So again, these are long neurons, and so these are called our upper motor neurons. The ones that have their cell bodies in the spinal cord and go to the muscle would be lower motor neurons. Okay, so does this area control our movements and plan our movements? No, it just sends the action potentials that will go to the muscles. So there's an area that's just in front of this that's called the premotor. And you can also say motor association area. And this is the area that plans, and it actually stores memories, very interesting, of any movements that are somewhat complex that we have learned. Okay, complex movements. So really this includes, a lot of things we do on a daily basis, tying our shoes, brushing our teeth, any kind of sports that you might play. So this area has to then kind of send information to the primary motor, which in turn sends the signals to the muscles that we will use. Notice that we said stores memories. These association areas, you can think of these as storing memories. Whether it happens to be, a sensory association, or in this case, it's a motor association area, they store memories of things we have learned. The primary areas are more in touch with the actual body. Like this is the area that actually sends the action potentials that go to the muscles that we use. So they're kind of in more direct communication with the body. Okay, so the premotor area would be right in here, just anterior to the primary. Okay, notice there's an area right here shown in purple. This borders that lateral sulcus. This is another important motor area. This is called the motor speech area, also called Broca's area. Okay, motor speech. So this name tells you exactly what it's going to do. You can use either name, I do not care. This controls muscles of speech. This is sometimes damage and strokes, and so if people have damage to this area, they know what they want to say, but they can't execute the actual movement, because they can't control the muscles involved in speaking. But they understand speech, they know what they would like to say. MM is muscles, right? So those are the areas I want you to know in the frontal lobe. You guys have something on your list that you can cross out. It's called the frontal eye field. And this controls eye movements, but just take it off the list. Okay, frontal eye field. Okay, so let's go back into the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is more involved with sensory, receiving and interpreting sensory information. So going back into the parietal lobe, okay, we said this is the precentral gyrus. This gyrus here is called the post-central gyrus. Okay, and the post-central gyrus is the primary sensory area. It's the area that receives sensory information from most of the body. Okay, primary sensory. You can also say somatosensory, but just sensory is fine. Again, primary areas are in communication with the body. So this is the area that receives all of this sensory information coming in from the body. And this would be, things like touch, pressure, what we call proprioception, knowing where the body parts are located, like the position of the body, pain, temperature, from pretty much the entire body. This is not special senses. It's not vision or speed or hearing or taste, smell, any of those. Okay, so the information now is going to go into this area here, just behind the postcentral gyrus. This is called the somatosensory association area. So again, association area is stored memories. You can also just say sensory association area. Because this stores memories of all of our sensory experiences, this is the area that recognizes what's happening. Okay, so recognizes sensory stimuli or input or information, whatever you want to call it. Okay, recognizes what you're feeling or touching or the different kinds of sensations that we experience. When you hold an object with your eyes closed, you know what it is because this area stores a memory of what it feels like. Okay, going back into the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, you can think of it as being vision, primarily for receiving and recognizing visual images. So back here in the most posterior part of the occipital lobe, notice this is the primary visual area. And notice you can use the terms cortex and area interchangeably, okay? When you say area, it's understood that you're talking about part of the cortex. So the primary visual area is the area that first receives the visual images, okay? As they come in from the optic nerve, they go back to the primary. But where are they going to go from here? Where would they go from here to be recognized? That's right, into the visual association area, which is just in front of the primary visual area. Okay, so visual association area, and this area again is going to store memories of things that we have seen. This is highly organized, so there's an area for faces, like where you recognize faces of people you know, you recognize your own face, places that you've seen, objects, it's kind of all divided up. Okay, and then the temporal lobe is similar, but this is going to be for auditory input. So this area here, you can see it kind of borders the lateral sulcus. This is the primary auditory area that first receives all of the auditory signals as they come in. And then there is a larger association area outside of that that stores memories of things we've heard. So again, it's really organized. So there's an area where you would be able to recognize people's voices. There's an area for like your ringtone on your phone. There's an area for music you've heard. Okay, so the primary auditory is the area that first receives signals first. Again, these primary areas are more connected with the body. The actual sensory input is going into them. And then the auditory association would store memories, and so it recognizes what you're hearing. Okay, so just a couple more areas. In the insula, this is where taste is located. Do you have a question, Kelly?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, are some of these areas stronger in some people than others, like visual learners that can have maybe a more organized association area for the visual?
Yes. Yeah, so areas in the brain can be developed. And whether we are born that way or we develop them later, I think both can happen. But, like Einstein, I think when they did an autopsy on his, actually looked at his brain, I think he had a really, really highly developed spatial orientation area. So I'm sure that allowed him to comprehend, really complex, abstract kinds of, information that, of course, we look at things that he was working on, and it's just like, for me, speaking for myself, just like, it's hard to even imagine. And so, yes, and different people, different areas can be more or less developed for whatever reason. I don't know how well understood that is, why we're born with certain areas more or less developed.
Is there ways, like, to improve, like, that area?
I'm sure there are.
Cause, like, I heard, like, the brain's kind of muscle, so if you, like, for instance, if you read, or, like, there's, like, certain memory games that you play that, like, help, like,
Yeah.
pretty much work it out.
And they definitely do make a difference, so I guess, depending on your own, whatever you're trying to develop, you have to kind of find what works for you. But I know that there are definitely ways to kind of develop certain skills, just like we learn any kind of skill, whether it's how to play an instrument or, we hear someone who's like a real, say, virtuoso on an instrument, and you think, oh my gosh, they were born with this talent, they had to be. But they say, brain experts say no, that is not the case. They say it's really practice.
That's true, cause my friend, he's really good, and he puts in, like, 3 or 4 hours a day in his work.
Yes. Yeah.
So, practice.
So I think to practice that much, you have to have a real liking in it, you have to be drawn to it. Or you have to have someone who's kind of forcing you to do it, like your parents. But at some point, when you grow up, you're gonna quit if you don't really like it. So I think that's key, is to really do something you like.
I heard that the frontal lobe doesn't develop until you're like 25.
It doesn't. Yeah, so the area here called the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until we're like in our early 20s, about 25, I think, is what I've heard.
And what is
also.
that?
So because of that, this is why, when you guys are, although I know a lot of you are very young, you are old enough, I think, to get that, sometimes teenagers do things that are not the smartest. I know looking back, you just kind of want to have fun, and you do things that like later you're like, what was I thinking? So, and it's partly because, lack of experience maybe, they're young, but also it's because this area is not fully developed. And this is the area that's really responsible for helping us make good judgments, taking different things into consideration and not just acting impulsively. And there are people who have impulse control disorders where this area of the brain may not be functioning as well as it could. And so that's another problem that can affect this area, not just lack of maturity, but it can actually lead to very impulsive and destructive behavior. Yeah.
So like you said, if you wanted to work that part of the brain out, what would you have to do?
I don't know. I think that if there's something that's actually wrong with, an area where there is lack of development, lack of normal development, I don't know. I guess it would depend on the degree of severity, how bad the problem is. And then, of course, there's always medication. Now there's so many medications that can help with different, control different kinds of behaviors. So that's something that is a good thing. We've come a long way with psychiatric disorders and medications that don't have really as many side effects as they used to. So that's something that can be considered. But as far as like a therapy, like you're thinking of what you can do to, I don't know. I think maybe a psychologist that specializes in that area would be helpful, but I'm not sure.
You can probably Google it, research.
Yeah.
That's how I found out,
Mhm.
like ways to improve your memory, and or like ways to like improve your hand-eye coordination. They have like different it's kind of weird, kind of cool.
Exercises you can even look up online
Yeah,
probably
they
for
have a bunch
specific
of,
things.
for
Yeah.
like specific part of your brain. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's kind of neat to be able to, if you want to develop some skill, you can actually do, I think it's kind of neat to be able to do exercises to, like there is a way to actually improve, It gives us hope.
Give you hope.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's nice to be able to do something besides taking medication, Okay, guys, so I think I mentioned that the insula is where taste is located, right? And then I think we started talking about other stuff. So I would like you to know right here in the insula, this area, notice that it is labeled as the primary gustatory. Gustatory actually refers to taste. So I would like you to know that taste is in the insula, okay? Gustatory refers to taste, and it is in the insula. I think the reason they do not have an association area labeled here is I'm not sure that is really well known yet. Because when I started teaching, which I know sounds like eons ago, but it doesn't seem like a long time ago to me, they actually thought taste was right here. So it hasn't really been that long. Now they are putting taste in the insula. So again, with more research, kind of find out more about these different areas. And the brain is not the easiest place to research, because it's hard to do a surgery on on someone and ask them questions while you're actually poking around in their brain. But they actually do that. It's just, they don't get the chance very often. So they find a lot of this out through different kinds of experiments and seeing what areas of the brain light up, when they're doing imaging tests, when people are performing different kinds of tasks or experiencing different, sensory input. That's how they find a lot of this out. So anyway, this is gustatory. You can see how they're kind of pulling the temporal lobe back, and you can see they have the olfactory cortex labeled right here, okay, in green. Well, olfactory, as you guys know, is smell. This is really on the medial side of the temporal lobe. So what they're doing is they're pulling it back to try to show you that it's in the temporal lobe, but it's really like right in here. It's more on the medial side. Okay, so you should know that the olfactory cortex is in the medial temporal lobe. Okay? And I think that is it. I think that's all of those functional areas on your list. Okay? So you guys can take a look at this later. I know it seems difficult when it's not all color-coded, but I will make it very clear as to, exactly which area I'm pointing to, so you just have to know them. 1 second.
Can I ask if you could repeat that last part that you said when you were pointing at the front?
I'm sorry, say it again?
The front of the brain, you were just saying something about it, and I didn't.
The prefrontal cortex?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, this is the area that's not developed until people are about 25, not fully developed. And it's responsible for helping to control impulsive behavior, like making good decisions.
So, and you said the olfactory cortex is in the medial lobe?
The olfactory is in the medial temporal lobe. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so, whew, that was a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff for a skinny little area on the outer surface of the cerebrum. But again, this is where most of our neuron cell bodies are located, is in the cortex. Most of our neuron cell bodies are here in the gray matter here. So notice, you guys, this is what I was talking about before when I said that you can look at a frontal cut and see the insula. So notice this is the lateral sulcus here, right? This is a frontal section. So this thing here, this little crevice, is the lateral sulcus. This part of the brain right here, you see it has its own gray matter, that is the insula. Okay? I may ask you to identify it on this frontal cut. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more of the cerebrum that you can see here in this frontal section. And by the way, just so you know, whenever you see these photographs of the real brain, they're good to look at just so you can see the real thing, but I will not put these on the test. I will use the diagrams, okay? So just so we get oriented, notice here, this is longitudinal fissure. Here we have these 2 ventricles that are in the cerebrum. These would be the lateral ventricles. Okay, this one right below them would be, what's the next ventricle there?
The third ventricle.
The third ventricle, right. This little kind of very thin membrane between the 2 lateral ventricles, this is called the septum pellucidum. And that is a structure that's on your list. Septum pellucidum. Okay? And this tract right here, going across the midline, that would be connecting the right and left sides of the brain. Corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more of this white matter. We said that white matter is myelinated axons. And these are just going to be connecting the brain to the spinal cord, connecting parts of the brain to each other. But notice that they have to travel through this narrow area here between these nuclei. Remember, a nucleus is just a group of neuron cell bodies. So as the axons travel through here, they have a special name, and it's labeled for you here. I know this is like really tiny. This is called the internal capsule. I know it's a strange name. Internal capsule. Okay, so that's just the special name for the white matter in that location. Okay, internal capsule. Those axons. Now, as they go up to the cortex, you can imagine these are going to go to different parts of the cortex. They have to kind of radiate out. So they would look kind of like this, going up toward the cortex. This is not labeled in your book, but up here, the axons are called the corona radiata, which means radiating crown. Okay, so I would like you to know that. And you can't really see them here, but you just have to know it's in this area, right? This is the corona radiata. If you look up the corona radiata in the index of the book, it will actually tell you that it's in the ovary, but that's a different corona radiata, okay? We'll talk about that one later. Okay, do you guys have that? Okay, and then one more area that's in the cerebrum. I'm gonna erase this just so we can see it. Okay, so we said that all these groupings here are neuron cell bodies kind of in a little cluster. Okay, so let's talk about these that are shown here in this kind of, whatever color, turquoise. And there's this part of it also. So this little grouping of nuclei has a special name. It is called the basal nuclei. Okay, so it's these three nuclei. This one here that looks round is called the caudate nucleus. Okay, caudate. This actually is like a C shape, so it has kind of a little tail. If you remember, caudal means tail, so that's why it's called the caudate. Okay, then this one here, this more medial, is called the globus pallidus. And then this one that's just lateral to it is called the putamen. Okay, and these two together have a name. If you'd like to know their name, if you want to kind of group them together, you can call them the lentiform nucleus. Okay, so I would like you to know them individually, but just so you know, together they are called the lentiform nucleus. So this group of nuclei actually works together to help us control skeletal muscle contraction. So they are kind of in communication with our motor cortex, helping to kind of regulate certain kinds of contractions. So one thing that this group of nuclei does is it will prevent us from having kind of spastic, jerky-looking movements. There is a disease that affects this group of nuclei called Huntington's disease. It's a genetic disease, and people who have Huntington's don't start having symptoms till usually they're around 40. And they will have kind of flailing movements with their extremities. They can't control facial expressions. And it is progressive, so it will eventually affect other parts of the brain, and it's eventually fatal. But it begins in the basal nuclei. Okay, so this group of nuclei helps to make our movements look kind of more smooth and coordinated, and also controls things that are just rhythmic, repetitive movements, like when you swing your arms, when you're walking. It's controlled by this group of nuclei, that kind of just repetitive, rhythmic motion. Okay, so we'll just say that the basal nuclei helps to coordinate skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, which is just saying what it does in kind of a general way. Okay, basal nuclei. Okay guys, so I'm sure you're all tired. I just want to cover one more part of the brain for today, and then we'll finish it next time. Okay? Questions on this before we go on? Okay, so let's talk about the diencephalon, the area that's just below the cerebrum. The diencephalon has kind of three main regions. Oh, and we've already talked about all of this. Yay! This is just a fun little diagram. This will not be on the test, but this just shows you the parts of the body and how they're represented on the motor cortex, and there's also one for the sensory. And so you can see, like, for each body part, it shows you how much of the cortex is devoted to that area. So notice how large the hand is. And this makes sense because we have to use our hands to do so many things. So we have a lot of motor neurons going to the hand to help control movement there. So that's why the body looks kind of distorted, because different body parts have more representation than others. And same thing with the sensory cortex. Okay, so this is all stuff we just talked about. Okay, so for the diencephalon, these are the three main regions. First of all, let's talk about the epithalamus. This is the roof of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is in the diencephalon, and a little gland called the pineal gland. And as you know, epi means above. The main structure in the diencephalon is the thalamus. And the thalamus is really a group of nuclei. You don't need to know the names of all those nuclei, just know the name thalamus. And it is nicknamed the sensory relay station because it receives almost all sensory information from the entire body. It actually receives everything except smell. And what it will do is as it receives this information, it actually decides how important it is, and it will then send it up to the cortex. If it's something that's important, it sends it on. If it's not important, it's not going to bother the cortex with it, okay? So it kind of sorts all of this information out, and it prioritizes it, decides what's important and what's not, and it sends it to the cortex. So it's kind of the, I don't know, secretary for the cortex. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus, hypo meaning below, and this is an important area for autonomic functions. Autonomic meaning it controls everything we can't control voluntarily. Okay, so it's actually a huge number of functions. This area controls the autonomic nervous system, which is all of our neurons that control things like heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, anything we aren't controlling voluntarily. And it also controls the pituitary gland. Okay, and the pituitary gland secretes a bunch of different hormones that in turn control other glands in the body. So through these two things, the autonomic nervous system and the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus controls a huge number of functions. And this is just kind of an overview of these areas. I'll show you each one of them.
What is the title of this slide mean?
Diencephalon is the area of the brain that's below the cerebrum. So we're starting with the cerebrum, working our way down. You guys have that? Okay, so this is the diencephalon, and this is the corpus callosum, right? Notice that this is the septum pellucidum. Remember we said that the septum pellucidum is that membrane that's between the lateral ventricles. So just lateral to this would be the lateral ventricles. Like if you could stick something through here, it would go into the lateral ventricle on the other side of that. Okay, this whole area here is the diencephalon. Okay, this is actually the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. So the third ventricle would be right here. It's literally in the midline, right here. Okay, it's where my hand is. Remember we said that it looks like there's a little hole in the third ventricle because a little piece of tissue has to pass through it. This is the piece of tissue. This is called the interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass of the thalamus. Okay, so this connects the two sides of the thalamus. The thalamus is right here. It's kind of an oval-shaped group of nuclei.
Wait,
Okay.
Which one was the thalamus? Which one was the thalamus?
This is the thalamus. and this is the little piece of tissue that connects the two sides. You can either call this the interthalamic adhesion, or you can say intermediate mass. Same thing. Okay, this area right below that is the hypothalamus, right in here. Okay, so we said that the epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle. Epi means above, so it's kind of the stuff above the thalamus here. So the roof of the third ventricle, and this little gland, this is the pineal gland. Okay, so let's talk about the pineal gland, and then we'll go on to the thalamus. The pineal gland secretes a hormone that's called melatonin. This is probably something you guys have heard of because this has been sold now as a supplement for a long, long time. This makes you sleepy because this actually increases in the blood at night. So when it's dark, we get an increase in melatonin secretion. It's one of the things that helps to make us sleepy. This is why it's difficult for people to sleep during the day because, for one thing, we have the secretion of melatonin at night. And so this gland, the pineal gland, its function is to help control things that repeat on a cyclic basis, like the sleep-wake cycle or day-night cycle, sometimes called the sleep-wake cycle. It also, the pineal gland also has an influence over our sex hormones. So this will also affect the menstrual cycles of females and will also affect the onset of puberty in both males and females because it interacts with our sex hormones.
So the pineal gland is also known as the sleep-wake cycle?
No, it's just that the pineal gland secretes this hormone, which I'd like you to know, which affects the sleep-wake cycle. Okay, and that's all you need to know about it. That's its main function, is controlling the sleep-wake cycle. Okay, so the thalamus. The thalamus is the biggest structure in the diencephalon. And again, this is really a large group of nuclei, but just know the whole thing is called the thalamus. It has that piece of tissue in the middle that connects the two sides. And this is what I wrote down before, so I think you already have this. Its function is to receive sensory information from the body, and it kind of sorts it out, decides what's important, and then it sends the important stuff up to the cortex. Okay, you guys have that? Okay, and then this is a more detailed picture of the thalamus. You do not need to know all of these different nuclei though, okay? Don't worry about that. Okay, and then finally the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a little piece of tissue called the infundibulum. Okay, this is on your list. And so this is how it controls the pituitary. It actually is directly connected to it, and it actually controls all of the hormones coming from the pituitary gland. And these hormones in turn go out into the body and control other endocrine glands in the body. So the pituitary gland secretes like 9 different hormones, and it is controlled by the hypothalamus. So because of that, the hypothalamus controls so many autonomic functions, and this is just a partial list, okay? But you can see how important the hypothalamus is. It controls body temperature, it controls thirst and hunger sensations, controls certain emotions, as well as sex drive, controls growth, metabolism. Metabolism is how fast our cells break down nutrients to provide energy, water and electrolyte balance, urine output, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, all those things are controlled by the hypothalamus. Mm-hmm.
Where's what's it called, like the limbic system? Something like that.
The limbic system is, it includes part of the hypothalamus. So that's why certain emotions are located in the hypothalamus. But the limbic system is something we'll talk about next time. It's the area that controls all of our emotions. Okay, so again, this is just a partial list. This is a more detailed picture of the hypothalamus, but you do not have to know the names of all these nuclei. Just know the whole thing is the hypothalamus. This is the infundibulum. I would like you guys to know that. Okay, that connection to the pituitary gland. Okay, and that is it for now. So next time we're gonna talk about the brain stem, all those parts of the brain stem. We will finish the brain and we'll talk about cranial nerves, and I'm gonna try to start the spinal cord next time. Okay. But once we go through the brain, we will have done probably over half of the nervous system is the brain, okay? Okay guys, so models are out. Did we talk about these slides? We didn't talk about the slides. Okay, sorry you guys, let me just talk a little bit about the slides, then we'll be done. Okay, so there are only 2 slides for this test. And one is the multipolar neurons. And the neuroglial cells. Okay, so what you'll see on this slide are really just kind of scattered multipolar neurons. You can also use the laser disc for this. And you'll see all of the dendrites and all that stuff, the axon. You do not have to identify these processes though, because it actually is hard to tell which is which. So just know it's a multipolar neuron. And then you'll see a bunch of nuclei out here. These are the nuclei of the neuroglial cells. You will not be able to tell what these are. They just are nuclei of neuroglial cells. You won't know if they're microglia or astrocytes. You don't have to name the type of cell. Just know they are neuroglial cells, okay? And this would be a multipolar neuron. And it's just that easy. That's all there is to it. It's really easy. Okay, the other slide is gonna be a cross-section and also a longitudinal section through a nerve. Okay, and so the cross-section, this means cross-section, will look like this. Okay, so you're gonna see a bunch of cuts through axons. These are myelinated axons, so they will look like this. And I'm gonna label what I want you to identify. Okay, so you'll see a bunch of that. This thing right in the center is the axon. It's the cut end of the axon. They're coming out toward you, okay? This white stuff would be the myelin sheath, right? Because these are gonna be myelinated axons. And then the outer circle is, remember we said that the membrane of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma. This is the neurolemma. Okay, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so on that same slide, you will see a longitudinal section, and this is basically the same, except they're traveling long ways. Now, you have to look for a node of Ranvier, otherwise this will look like a bunch of lines, okay? So what you wanna do is you wanna look for a node of Ranvier or neurofibril node. Remember, they look like that, right? When you see one of those, then you can get oriented and you can say, aha, the thing in the center is the axon, right? Okay, so this is our node of Ranvier. Okay, the white stuff around the axon would be the myelin sheath, right? And the outer membrane of the Schwann cell is the neurolemma. Okay? So these are the things you should be able to identify. And you'll see other nodes, you just have to kind of look around, you'll see them here and there. And wherever you see a node, then you can kind of figure out what's what. Okay? that's it. Those are the only slides for this unit. Okay, you guys, so enjoy.